So welcome everyone. We're recording this session as Zoom has let you know. We also have enabled the live transcript for closed captioning, and you may find that option on the control bar that usually appears at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're extending the warmest welcome to the third ADSLE Spotlight in this series on the topic of ecologies of place and resilience. I'm Kate Huber. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Culture Studies at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. For those of you joining as an ASLE event for the first time, a special welcome. We are so glad you have joined us today and invite you to help sustain and further our work by becoming an ASLE member if you have not already joined the association. ASLE acknowledges its office is located within the Endokina, the ancestral homeland, the ancestral and unceded homeland of the Abenaki people along the Quanatech and Ashwilot watersheds, and in the shadow of Mount Monadnock. We recognize that this land has been cared for by the Abenaki for at least 12,600 years, including by the Sokoke, Pennacook, and other Wabanaki peoples. ASLE offers this statement as a way of affirming its commitment to recognizing and supporting Native history and culture in the Monadnock region and all regions where our members and officers dwell, past, present, and future. ASLE's leadership launched this series in 2021 to elevate the work of our members in creative writing, scholarship, public engagement, and more. We are excited to continue to foster connections with new audiences through the spotlights. By way of logistical information, we will ask that you remain on mute, and we'll have time for questions later. We'll ask that you use the chat to post your questions, so please keep the questions concise since we only have a few brief minutes together, or only brief minutes. So now I will introduce my co-host, Aubrey Streit Krug, is a writer and teacher in the environmental humanities who studies stories of relationships between humans and plants. She's currently the director of the Perennial Cultures Lab at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, and was just elected as ASLE's Public Engagement Officer. She earned her PhD in English and Great Plains Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So welcome, Aubrey. I think we'll go on to our first presenter. Alison Turner. So Alison Turner grew up in the mountains of Colorado, where she learned to endure large amounts of time in inclement weather waiting for buses. Her creative work appears in Blue Mesa Review, Wordrunner eChapbooks, Little Patuxent Review, Meridian, and Bacopa Literary Review, among others. And her first collection of short stories, Defensible Places, was published by Torrey House Press in 2023. She is a 2022-2024 ACLS Leading Edge Postdoctoral Fellow in Jackson, Mississippi, where she coordinates a community-based oral history project and facilitates creative writing workshops with writers incarcerated at the Parchman State Penitentiary.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much to the organizers. I love this idea where we're bringing together really different projects and ways of thinking into the same topic, which I think is just one of the best ways to collaborate and move forward together. So Defensible Spaces is a collection of short stories. It's 10 short stories that were intended to stand on their own, but they are also part of this. They're connected in many ways. They are all about the same town, a small town named Clayton, Colorado. They're also connected thematically, particularly around what at first might appear kind of a surface level use of language having to do with fire. Each chapter is titled something to do with fire management, quote unquote, such as mitigation. Defensible Spaces is one of the title chapters. They're also kind of the story kind of loosely follows these two young girls growing up in this small mountain town. The stories are not arranged linearly. I was trying to sort of like break any kind of simple kind of growth story. Like it's not necessarily as simple as that. I'm kind of trying to complicate what's going on between growing up in a space that is kind of understood to be wild, and how that wildness gets into people, or how maybe people push that wildness away. There's also themes such as masculinity and intimacy. I think I grew up in the mountains, and so I think a lot about how people move to the mountains or stay there with sort of a desire to be alone and away from people, but how it's never quite as simple as that. Um, and yeah, those are kind of some of the main themes that I try to explore in this collection.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Allison. Looking forward to talking more about your work. Hi everyone, I'm Aubrey, and I wanted to make sure we didn't miss an introduction to our other co-host who you've heard from, Kate Huber. I'm really delighted to be co-hosting with today. So Kate specializes in multimedia cultural analysis, post-colonial studies, and transnational environmental justice, with a focus on Anglophone Irish, African, and Caribbean literatures and cultures, especially including diaspora cultural production in Britain. Kate's an assistant professor of digital art, ecology, and communication in the Department of Culture Studies at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, and is the contingent and independent advocacy officer for ASLI. So next up, we're going to hear from Heather Alexis Smith. Heather Alexis Smith is assistant curator at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in the Grand Center Arts District in Midtown St. Louis. She earned her BA in art history from the University of Florida and her MA in art history and archaeology from the University of Missouri, Columbia, where she focused on the art of the later Middle Ages. Since joining the Pulitzer in 2016, Heather's worked on a variety of exhibitions, with topics ranging from the destruction of artworks in ancient Egypt, drawing in 19th century Japan, and the practices of modern sculptors Ruth Asawa and Terry Adkins. For our ASLI Spotlight today, Heather will discuss her most recent exhibition, The Nature of Things, Medieval Art and Ecology, 1100 to 1550, which investigates the intrinsic connections between art, people, and the environment in the second half of the European Middle Ages. So Heather.
All right, is my mic working? Are we all good? Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Aubrey, for the introduction and for inviting me here to share the nature of things, medieval art and ecology with you all today. And I would just say, for the sake of simplicity, I have just one image of the installation up on the screen here. But if you want to read the interpretive content for the exhibition and see more photos of the artworks in the installation, you're more than welcome to go to www.pulitzerarts.org, where you can find more on the exhibition. So The Nature of Things was on view at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, which is in St. Louis, Missouri, and it was on view from March through August of 2023. It featured around 50 objects made in Western Europe in the second half of the Middle Ages. And the show was designed as a survey, focusing on the materials used to make art objects for sacred and secular use in Europe, although when appropriate, I interpreted many of the objects in a global context. The Nature of Things was the first eco-critical exhibition of medieval art, examining how art-making practices affected environments, both temporarily and permanently, through the cultivation, extraction, and refinement of materials. And the goal was really not to cast value judgments on the practices of past civilizations, but to offer more nuanced and comprehensive histories of art objects. The exhibition also sought to reposition the environment as a guiding force for humanity rather than a backdrop to it. And this was done by looking at how various aspects of the natural world, like topography, climate, hydrology, botany, and even geology, influence the production of artworks, often determining their types, forms, materials, locations of manufacture, and their imagery. And I also related the objects and their imagery to medieval attitudes about and observations of the natural world. Now, art museums don't typically ask visitors to consider the environment's foundational role in and relationship to artistic practices of the past. So, to foster this line of thinking, I divided the exhibition into 4 sections, each devoted to a basic ecosystem from which the object's major materials were harvested. And these included forest, field, mine, and quarry. And you're looking here at the slide on the screen at a snapshot from the field section of the show. I, of course, selected objects based on their ability to illuminate the organizing principles of the show. So how does art making affect the environment, and how does the environment affect art making? And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of the content in each section. So the first section was called Forest, and it included artworks for which wood was a primary material or a major fuel source. So architectural fragments, sculpture, paintings on panels of wood, and stained glass. And a key goal in this section was to demonstrate how each species of tree bears wood with a particular hardness or density, moisture content, and texture. Visitors were invited to compare and contrast objects made of different types of wood to see how these properties guided the hand of the sculptor and how they dealt with and addressed the wood in question. The second section of the exhibition was called Field, and it featured objects made with plant and animal matter, wool and silk textiles, books made of parchment and paper, and sculpture made of bone, ivory, or shell. A key focus was land use conflicts and competition for natural resources, especially as it related to sheep farming. Sheepskin was used for parchment, like the book that you see at right here, or rather at center here in the screen. And sheep wool was used for cloth, which you see used in the large tapestry toward the left of this image. So sheep were really important to medieval economies, but they were also blamed for decreasing the space for farmland to produce food and for destroying the environment by overgrazing. So it was really interesting to be able to discuss these objects based on some of these land use tensions. The third section looked at objects made by quarrying stone and mining metals. So it included stone architectural fragments and ecclesiastical objects made with silver, gold, and copper. Mining and quarrying were, and still are, predicated on extracting non-renewable resources. So these permanently transform landscapes and leave massive voids in the earth that remain today. So this section really encouraged people to consider how the production of an artwork might leave a permanent trace on a landscape. So we can think kind of about how one might transform a mountain into a cathedral by extracting and refining that stone. And then the final section of the show was called Earth. It included ceramics and glass, objects dependent on a raft of other industries like quarrying sand and clay, mining metals that were used to color glass and glazes, and forestry, which was used to generate massive quantities of fuel that were used to fire the ceramics and melt the glass. So this section featured several ceramics from medieval Spain, which were reliant on metals mined hundreds of miles away in England, North Africa, and potentially even the Middle East. And this revealed how the demand for art-making resources in one location might impact environments hundreds of miles away, a phenomenon that I think certainly has a contemporary resonance. So all of this content and more was addressed in the written materials for the show, but as a way of helping visitors connect these concepts to the artworks on view, I also worked with game designers to develop an iPad that was situated in each space, and it presented images made by medieval artists that show medieval people extracting materials from environments and transforming them into works of art. So you've had the visual evidence, the supporting evidence available to look at. And ultimately, I hope the show encouraged people to consider how artworks illustrate human impacts on the natural world, but also the ways in which environments themselves are key collaborators in cultural production. So thank you so much for having me here to share.
So thanks so much, Heather. Now we're going to hear from David Taylor. David Taylor is an associate professor and faculty director of the Environmental Humanities track in the Sustainability Studies program in the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences at Stony Brook University. He is lead editor and contributor to an Island in the Stream, Ecocritical and Literary Responses to Cuban Environmental Culture. David has traveled to Cuba for over 10 years, collaborating with writers, artists, and scholars at Consejo Nacional Artes Escénicas, Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez de la Naturaleza y el Hombre, Unión Nacional Escritores y Artistas Consejo, the Cuban Writers Organization, and the Department of Geography at the University of Havana. His upcoming books include Theaters of Engagement, under contract with the University of Wyoming Press, and Paddling Around the Paumanok, a kayak trip around Long Island to home. So thank you, David.
Thank you. Sorry for the Spanish. My own Spanish is actually pretty limited. A little bit of background. In 2013, through some contacts of people who had just come to the US, I was able to make some professional connections to the University of Havana and their geography department. If you don't know, Cuba is considered the most sustainable country in the Western Hemisphere by the World Wildlife Fund. This is in part because of the way it discusses carbon footprint, the possibility of sort of future projection, sort of development and taking care of its citizens. It's a very complex and I think very complicated idea to say it's the most sustainable country. I think a lot of this is because of the embargo that the US has on Cuba, which limits a lot of goods coming in. So once you're outside of the major cities in Cuba, it really is, there are very few cars. It's all sort of, horse and bicycle. You just don't see a lot of this. So in some ways, it's a very complicated idea. But during my time down there working with the different sustainability scientists, I got to be very interested in the idea of the way sustainability and environmental thought is sort of promoted, especially in the rural areas. And again, keep in mind, Cuba as a socialist nation pays its artists. So if you're a licensed actor or musician or writer, you are a government employee. And there's a number of reasons for this. One of them is, to be quite honest, to sort of put down dissent. But another one is that this sort of idea of culture is one of the ways that Cuba communicates its idea of value systems and culture. And so there are theater groups, paid theater groups in almost every town, over probably 2,000 people. And one of the things I came to see is that these theater groups actually were really involved with communicating environmental kinds of problems, ways of dealing with it, and were often trained by the scientists about how to think about their performances and the kinds of topics to bring up. In 2015, I was co-edited a section of 5 of these groups for ISLE. If you want a chance to go look at it, some of those also have links to websites, to performances. And then, as you may have seen, the film Cuban Earth that was directed by Melinda Levin came out a few years ago. And we focused especially on this one group called TECMA, or Teatro Callejero Medioambiental, meaning like street theater about the environment. And what they do is this group is particularly interested in trying to talk about the local kinds of problems that are faced in Western Cuba. Pinar del Rio, their town, is in the West. And the performances are really interesting in the way that they sort of address these issues. Their performances actually encourage the people watching to participate in the performance in the street. The whole town actually will shut down during these performances in order to come out and watch them. And it has a profound influence on the way that these ideas about engaging environmental issues and problems and thinking about caring and place are sort of disseminated through these traditions. And by traditions, I mean that within, since the revolution in '59, Cuba's arts play a large part in the way that people imagine their sense of community and place and values. And this is the one then where this theater group, TICMA, you see these elaborate costumes. Actually, much of the materials for these costumes come from reuse from the landfill. And then all of the materials, the scraps of the materials, the people who actually make the costumes actually will use the rest of it and make clothing for children and then sell it for almost nothing to the community as a way of helping the community and binding the community. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, David. It's really interesting. Okay, I'm looking forward to tracing some of these connections across presenters, but we have one more person to hear from. I'm excited to hear from Jessica Cory next, so we'll move north a little bit. Jessica Cory teaches in the English department at Appalachian State University and is a PhD candidate specializing in Native American, African American, and environmental literatures at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She is the editor of Mountains Piled Upon Mountains, Appalachian Nature Writing in the Anthropocene, and the co-editor with Laura Wright of Appalachian Ecocriticism and the Paradox of Place, which just came out in 2023. Her creative and scholarly writings have been published in the North Carolina Literary Review, North Dakota Quarterly, Northern Appalachia Review, and other fine publications. Originally from southeastern Ohio, she currently lives in western North Carolina. So I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you so much. So I also just wanted to give a shout out. Dr. Michael Martin, one of the contributors to Appalachian Ecocriticism and the Paradox of Place, is actually in the audience today. So I just wanted to kind of give him a nod as well. So with Appalachian Ecocriticism and the Paradox of Place, Laura Wright and I really wanted to highlight the various types of excellent ecocritical work that scholars are doing in regards to Appalachian literature. The impetus for this book was noticing that eco-critical analyses of Appalachian texts, kind of broadly defined, would be presented at the Appalachian Studies Association's annual conference and would sometimes appear in print, such as in volumes of like Appalachian Journal, Journal of Appalachian Studies, ISLE, and a few other venues. But there was no collection that really studied Appalachian ecocriticism and presented it as a cohesive way of reading the region's literature. So as a whole, Appalachian literature seemed to be missing, or at least on the outskirts of many of these ecocritical conversations, which we found compelling, especially as so much of the region is often discussed in terms of environmental issues, like the impacts of mountaintop mining, pipeline building, fracking, deforestation, and floods. And yet elements of the region are conversely often heralded for ecotourism, such as the Appalachian Trail and the lovely mountains of western North Carolina. So Fred Wadji also notes in his essay, Exploring the Life Territory, Ecology and Criticism in Appalachia, and we include this quote in the introduction, that both ecocriticism and Appalachian studies share, quote, a history of definitional ambiguity and diversity, end quote. There have been many maps of what is or isn't Appalachia over the years, and of course, Appalachia is itself a colonial construct, which further kind of muddies those waters. These definitional issues then impact whose work is seen as Appalachian because of insulting stereotypes of the region's residents for centuries, frequently by people traveling to the region to exploit those who live here or to engage in what's sometimes called like poverty porn. Not to mention the issues with painting a large swath of people in one light, almost always white and conservative or backward. Those of us living in the region and from the region, and I speak for Laura here too, her family has deep roots in Western North Carolina. But we're rightly concerned about who is portraying the places we call home and to what end. I also believe that these stereotypes might be, at least in part, somewhat to blame for the lack of published ecocritical scholarship in the region, or the lack thereof, really. sort of combined by the fact that Appalachian literature, and of course I'm including Afro-Appalachian literature and literature by indigenous peoples who have called this region home long before it was dubbed Appalachia, even if they're currently writing out of diaspora, this literature isn't widely taught, especially outside of the region, despite the fact that people with ties to the area reside all over the globe. And in shepherding this book, we knew that we wanted to include analyses of a variety of genres, and the collection includes work on fiction, poetry, book history, philosophy, film, nonfiction. We also wanted to go broad on eco-critical theories of place and include, for example, queer ecological readings, eco-theological readings, eco-feminist understandings of the texts, and so on. We also wanted to consider Appalachian adjacent writers, which is why Wendell Berry's work is included, though for the most part, the writers whose work is analyzed have connections to the counties delineated through the Appalachian Regional Commission, which offers kind of the broadest official definition of the region, running from upstate New York to parts of Alabama and Mississippi. Many of the environmental concerns I mentioned earlier do appear in the texts that our scholars analyze, including flooding and Ron Rash's 1 Foot in Eden and Raising the Dead, and mountaintop removal and activism, and an analysis of the film Goodbye Golly Mountain. But we also did not want to only focus on texts that depicted environmental degradation, as this might simply portray the region as like yet another sacrifice zone, rather than a place where humans and beyond human beings are living and flourishing, and in many cases engaging in activities to mitigate some of these harms. And our goal again with this collection was not to kind of create a text that would be a be-all end-all presentation on the topic, but rather a way for researchers and readers beyond academia to enter into these conversations and have an introduction to what eco-criticism of Appalachian texts can look like. I would love for other scholars and readers to really build on the eco-critical examples the book offers and begin to kind of more fully explore texts by a wider racial and ethnic diversity of Appalachian writers, as well as more contemporary activism and perhaps even a broader range of texts. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for these fascinating projects and for sharing them with us tonight. So I'm going to ask each of the presenters a question that you can respond to individually, and if other folks presenting also have things that they might think, oh, that sort of connects, feel free to also offer a response about a connection, so that we can kind of think about place a little bit more, and then yeah, focusing more on sort of connections between the different projects around our theme of place and resilience. So I guess I will start maybe with Alison, if that's all right. So I'm really curious about the Redbird Mine, which is in many of your short stories of this wonderful collection. So I just wondered, it almost comes across as a character in Clayton. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you see this mine and like the history of that mine shaping the place and the people's relationships to this place in your collection, and just kind of highlighting things.
Yeah, thank you. So this collection, like I said, each story aims to stand alone, but the goal was that, you know, the sum of the parts, the sum becomes bigger than the parts. So this mine is in several of the stories, not necessarily all of them, but the collection does open with the head frame of the Redbird Mine catching on fire. And it's not, the collection isn't a mystery of how this happens, but at the end, you do kind of, the end of the collection, you do kind of find out how this happened. So it kind of starts the theme of fire, but I think I'm really grateful for this question to think about the mine as a character, because it got me realizing how I have been thinking of mines as a tool for metaphor, as a metaphorical tool perhaps, and just thinking about how I think, especially from a kind of an environmental awareness perspective, we do associate mines with violence and extraction, of course. But I'm also starting to think, and I was thinking while writing this book, there's also something very intimate about tunnels under earth. We're seeing, if you're going under earth, you're experiencing a kind of intimacy with the land, violent though it may be. There's also in a more in terms of people and communities, like I said, this collection's trying to explore masculinity as well. There's something very intimate about groups of men being under earth together in these tunnels and their lives depending on one another to do this mining correctly, with all the dangers that occur. There's also something interesting about, I started thinking about, so roots are digging holes underground. How interesting that mines are these holes underground without a plant root. It's almost like can we think of what can hold these tunnels underground? Are they somehow in relationship with living things growing roots? Are they maybe a way of us, we people, our societies asking, is it sort of a signal that we don't have roots? These are just questions I started thinking about while meditating on what mines do to a place. Also in this collection, it's not an active mine. And as many of you may know, all around Colorado, there's tons of former mining towns. And it really does become a part of the culture. So that was kind of just in the atmosphere of this setting also.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I love this idea of kind of like exploring culture through almost the medium of soil and going into the earth. There's really something there, and it's interesting how it comes up in those stories. Since we're pressed for time, I'll move on to my next question for Heather, actually. You talked a bit actually already about sort of the need for medieval European art in discourses about the environment, as it often it's a very urgent issue, of course, today. So sometimes we think about these longer histories, perhaps less or not in such an urgent framing. So I was just kind of curious if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the role. We often only encounter also European medieval art in museums. So I'm curious if you can actually talk a little bit more about the role of museums and curation and the connections that an exhibit on medieval art or just in general with exhibitions, what that plays with kind of this tension between art and the environment that your exhibition brings into fruition so beautifully.
Yeah, well, it's such a good question, and it's one that was absolutely at the forefront of my mind while I was conceiving of and developing the exhibition. And just to give you a sense of how the show played out, I initially came up with the idea and pitched a very basic concept for it in December 2019, and then repitched it in February 2020, at which point, or shortly thereafter, the Pulitzer ended up closing for months, and we ended up really, the pandemic and an ecological or environmental disaster, if you will, certainly affected the way we operated as a museum. And in fact, the exhibition almost didn't happen because of it. And I had the opportunity to resurrect it. And it really was my COVID project. So I kind of came back to it in spring of 2021, having lived through and continuing to live through this pandemic. And so from the very beginning, I felt that if I was going to do an exhibition, an eco-critical exhibition, and if this was really going to be carried out in my museum, I also wanted to start interrogating my place in the ecological sphere and what, how my work might cause or contribute to environmental degradation. And that's something that I think a lot of curators are considering these days, because so much of our work is predicated on, the import and the export and the crating and packing up of objects and shipping them overseas. And so I started trying to design the exhibition with a little bit of an ecological impulse in mind. And that was kind of my answer to this question. So I started by trying to design the exhibition around objects that I could only get in the Midwest United States, because I wanted to reduce the carbon footprint as much as possible. And for a variety of reasons, I wasn't able to do that, namely because the pandemic really affected museums' abilities to lend objects. due to staff capacity and shutdowns. And so I did end up expanding and borrowing from other locations, but I definitely knew from the outset that it would be disingenuous for me to import a bunch of loan objects from Europe. So that actually literally affected how I got the objects and how I installed them in space. So that's been kind of my answer in trying to develop a little bit of an ecological ethic in curating. And there's certainly ways that that could be improved on. And I look forward to maybe teasing out some of those things in future shows that I do.
Well, it's very interesting. Yeah, I'm here in the Netherlands where we have museum like every 10 feet. Yeah, your project's really brought up a lot of things that I haven't really thought about with the carbon footprint of exchanging art and what as well. So thank you. That's really interesting. So I'll go ahead and move on to David, just so we can hear from all of the presenters again. So the video that you offered and kind of sharing your work with us was just is a really powerful a powerful performance and as well as a powerful engagement with the environment and with society. So I was kind of curious about two things, like you already talked about them using the landfill for the costumes, but they depict that a bit in the film, which is really beautiful. I didn't quite put that together, and so I'm just kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about some of the specific cultural and environmental connections and how they might play into some of the environmental issues around contamination and trash accumulation that they talk about in the film. So just sort of thinking about, because it almost seemed like you talked a bit about this as well already, that there's quite an emphasis on art, but I was just amazed at how beautiful these street performers could make their costumes, and they seem to be doing everything just like bringing community together. So I was curious if there was like an underlying Cuban cultural tradition where this had happened before, and also how that plays in with it environmental change or policy change.
Sure. So in particular, when you're talking about the group that's in the film and the image that was on my slide, Tecma, they're in a town in western Cuba called Pinar del Rio. And Pinar del Rio is best known for tobacco growing. It has the right soil, the right temperature, the right rainfall. And so for those people who like tobacco, not me, it is the place to go. But it's also a very, very challenged area. It's not a high tourist destination. There's a lot of poverty. And as you saw in the film, there's a lot of kinds of domestic issues, and especially child abuse, which is what the film is kind of addressing. But one of the traditions that the group borrows from that you might not notice is called the zancos, or stilts. So they perform on stilts, which is very much a tradition in tobacco growing. So after they've grown the tobacco and they've pulled, the plants, they have to dry them in the barns. And this is a long and extensive process. And so for the centuries since Spanish colonization, they've been using these stilts to move the leaves that are drying in the barn. And so it's a long, long, long tradition. Everyone involved with the tobacco growing or tobacco or cigar rolling, all of that, and again, it's probably 65% of the people in the area, they all know how to wear zancos. They all know how to use them. And so when they're teaching the kids in the film, what they're really doing is they're drawing on these sort of traditions that the town really knows and understands. What they're doing is they're teaching these kids who have either been removed from their homes because of domestic abuse or because the kids don't have any other options. And what they're doing is they're training the kids so that they can become another theater group, so that they're licensed artists and getting pay. And actually, all of those kids you saw in the film are now in another town called Matanzas, and they have their own theater group, and they're functioning just fine. But one of the things that you were talking about is addressing policy, and this is a really complicated thing in Cuba. You can't necessarily go up front and protest government policy. This is not going to work in Cuba. It's not going to work out well for you. So in the long tradition of sort of subversive art, you find ways of sort of building community external to government policy or external to some of the other things going on. So in that performance that you described, they have these very elaborate costumes. And the primary performance is one called En Busca de una Antigua, so in search of an old illusion. And it's a children's story everybody knows. It's a story that's told over and over again. And so what they did is they took that story, and it's about grandfather sea turtle. And grandfather sea turtle is choking because of the pollution in the local river where it opens up and goes into the ocean. And so what they do is, in doing this performance in the street, they actually have the children come in and perform with the actors on the zancos. And they retell this. And what they do is they replace it with the river names and locations that are near their area. So that way it sort of gets embedded in the way that they're telling it, where they're not critiquing the government and the policy, because otherwise they would be in trouble. But it's a way of sort of instilling the values of, well, let's stop some of the pollution. Let's start thinking about other ways of sort of taking, reuse, which in Cuba, it's a little complicated. Reuse in Cuba is everything. No one ever, like, you would never throw away a broken fan. You would never throw away anything. You just take it down the street and get it fixed. And so in many ways, the theater groups going to the landfill, that's a normal thing in Cuba. It's not as extraordinary as it seems to us. It's a very common thing to go find the materials that you need to build or to get by or to create, in this case, costumes. So in some ways, and this is very common. One of the groups, I will say, this is not TICMA, one of the other groups we interviewed actually had performed a performance in which the director and writer had been jailed because it was critical of the government. And yet the Cuban government wanted us to film that performance. And he was there talking about his history of being jailed. So it's an interesting one, how that works. And I'm the first to admit, I don't fully understand the nuances of how not to be jailed in Cuba. It seems a very complicated thing. But there is this sort of movement in and out of sort of dealing with these sort of policy issues. And I think often with theater sort of taking it on indirectly, which is a lot safer for most of the artists.
Thank you so much for that fantastic answer. That was really interesting about the stills and also just the politics and how people are using art as kind of activism in a very subversive but subtle way. That's really interesting. So thank you. That illuminates a lot about the film for me. So our final question for just one of the presenters is for Jessica, and I'm going to use the great question that Carla's put into the chat. So Carla writes, it seems that local governments in Appalachian places have been particularly adept at including the harm being done to place and people. I'm thinking of Kentucky in particular as an example. Does the book and your own scholarship explore this? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And thank you, Carla, for the great question. So in particular, my essay in the book, which is based on Robert Geip's trampoline, really does discuss that fairly in depth, because I don't know who here has read Trampoline, but there's this grandmother, and she is, a local activist, and she is kind of fighting back against the mining of a particular mountain in the book. And the protagonist, Dawn, is her granddaughter who, spends a lot of time with her and also kind of gets involved in some ways in this activism. And what we see throughout Geip's novel, which is largely based on conversations that he was having and things he was experiencing where he teaches in Kentucky, outside of Pikeville, I believe. And, you see in the book that the grandmother and granddaughter are getting all kinds of threats and things like that. Because again, to be an activist in these spaces where a lot of times, the economy relies on extractive industry, really does endanger kind of your well-being. And so when we think about the local governments in Appalachian places, we have to remember that, again, local governments mean these are people in your community, right? These are your neighbors. These are the people that you're going to run into at the Walmart. And so when we think about why they're trying to include this, a lot of times, again, it goes back to those economic reasons. It goes back to, kind of, I'm sure if we've driven through, West Virginia or Kentucky, you see all the coal keeps the lights on bumper stickers and the pro coal license plates and things. And again, a lot of that has to do with, those are sometimes the best paying jobs in the regions, right? And you don't want people kind of coming in and saying like, hey, what you're doing here is a really big problem, when your only alternative might be service work that pays a third of what you're making. And so I think, there are actually some essays in my first edited collection, Mountains Piled Up on Mountains, that also explore that, particularly with fracking in Pennsylvania, and some other things. So, as well as some flooding in West Virginia. So it is probably more explored from like a creative standpoint, with creative nonfiction in the first book, but it is addressed in this book as well. So again, a lot of it just comes back to kind of the economy of the region, and you don't really want people to kind of say, oh, hey, what you're doing is really problematic for the environment, because if they come down and shut down those jobs, right? Like we could even kind of, when Hillary went to West Virginia and said, your jobs aren't coming back, is it a surprise she doesn't get a lot of votes there? So just to give kind of a more recent example, but that's usually kind of what, is behind a lot of that occlusion, and sort of places not really wanting to let it be known publicly that some of these industries do harm place and people.
Thank you, Jessica. As we wind towards the end of our hour together, I wanted to see if we might make a few connections across the presentations and work, and do a little bit of a lightning round related to one question, which is one of the other themes of this spotlight. We've framed it around place and resilience. So I'm curious if we might each briefly share something about resilience. One thing that you might have learned through your work about resilience in relationship to the place and region your study focuses on. If you have an insight or a thought, a brief one about resilience, I'd love to popcorn around the presenters and hear that.
It's funny, I don't have like a wise statement about resilience, but the question really made me think about ghost towns, and what do ghost towns do when we think about resilience? There is a growing over in ghost towns sometimes. There's a remaining of some structures. There's memory and history. So yeah, I don't really, maybe it's more of a question, like what can ghost towns tell us about resilience?
I love that. Insights in the form of questions are wonderful to carry forward. Someone else have a thought or question to add about resilience? Jessica?
I would just say that, especially in Appalachia, we see resilience a lot of times in the form of activism, and that takes a lot of different kinds of approaches. For example, I know that the NC Extension Office for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians has like a seed giveaway, right? So they're actually continuing that indigenous biodiversity, and doing things like that. There's also a lot of activism through educational endeavors, like, the Black and Appalachia Project, or like Marie Cochran's thinking of, Heather's work with art. Marie Cochran does like, the Appalachian Artist Project and things like that. So what we see, in the region a lot of times through the resilience is done through a lot of educational endeavors and a lot of activism.
I would say, when I think about the Middle Ages and resilience, how that connects to the exhibition, there's an object and a story that immediately popped into my mind. It's this large alabaster plaque that shows Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden, that was featured in the show. And of course, I talk about the meaning of the garden and the fall from grace, and how that foregrounds a lot of concepts in medieval Western Christian society. But also, alabaster has such an interesting story as it relates to pandemic disease and the Black Death. And, of course, that pandemic killed between 30 and 60% of people in just a couple of years around 1350 in Western Europe, and was really a global phenomenon. And we can imagine, we've all just kind of lived with and are still living through a pandemic. But, imagining that magnified hundreds and hundreds of times over, and the death toll. But of course, people still have to go on living and making money. And something really interesting that happens in the visual arts is that, there's still a lot of research being produced on this, but it seems, especially in the case of alabaster sculpture, that this is actually a response to the labor shortages that come out of the huge loss of life, because alabaster is relatively easy to get at and it's relatively easy to carve. So you can mine it with just a couple of people. You can even, it's scratchable with a human fingernail. So just kind of thinking about how arts industries reshape and refashion themselves on a material basis to respond to these widespread cataclysmic events and kind of find ways to move forward. I always find that kind of story so interesting.
One of the things that I've found in Cuba that really is interesting to me is how arts play a part in the communities reimagining themselves. So for example, in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba went through what's called the special period, and there was severe poverty, starvation. It was really a challenging time. And this is about the time in the history of sort of theater and the arts in Cuba that they began to take up environmental issues, and especially around things like food production, and all of a sudden moving away from sort of Soviet agricultural practices and more sort of toward what's called the organoponicos, or the organic farms, which are now dotted throughout Havana and also in the countryside. And to come along with that, though, were songs, was poetry, was theater, was visual art. And it's the part where I see there, and a little bit of it is, again, the system and the way it works, but I see where concepts of resiliency are constantly in this moment of moving between the creative arts and into sort of practices. And that's that line that to me is such a beautiful, complex sort of idea. And it's a little easier to see this in the rural areas, maybe than in Havana or Santiago or something, or in the tourist areas. But in those rural areas where it's about Cubans needing to reimagine the possibilities, the arts and their reimagining what they can do is always so vitally interesting.
I love that. That's such a beautiful way to end if we have to, unless there are I think there was another question from the chat? Yeah, I think Malika asked a question. What can post-human ecologies post-human ecologies of medieval art communicate to the Anthropocene?
Well, I would just say that, from the very beginning, I really wanted this project to be one that decenters the human and recenters the environment. And I think that's something that was especially fruitful with the Middle Ages, and you could certainly apply this to many different pre-modern cultures and societies, because in the present moment, as I know all of us are aware, because we're talking about and thinking about these kinds of things, industrialization and shifts in technology have really disassociated many of us from our environmental surroundings. And obviously, I'm speaking in very, very blanket terms here. There are plenty of people who live in a much closer relationship to their environments, whether that's in an industrialized society or not in the present moment. But generally speaking, in the medieval world, everything's wrought by hand. Human survival depends on human relationships with and interactions with the environment. And so I think going back to the past to more deeply understand not only the present, but also how we might be able to function in the future is just a really, really fruitful.
Yeah, thank you, Heather, and thank you, Malika, for that wonderful question. Are there any other questions in the chat that I have missed? No, all right. Wonderful. Then thank you so much for coming tonight, and or I guess for most people it's the afternoon. Here in the Netherlands it's the night. So thank you for coming today. Wonderful presentations, everyone, really fascinating work. So we'll just give a round of applause to everyone.